Today, we'll discuss the uncomfortable truths we struggle to face and about the challenge that awaits us in the coming decades to face global warming. And with me, I'm lucky to have Jean-Marc Jancovici to talk about these fascinating topics. Jean-Marc, thank you for accepting our invitation. The interview format is a bit special on this channel. So I'll ask you to be indulgent with me, and much less so with Jean-Marc, who has mastered the subject. Jean-Marc, let me quickly introduce you for listeners who may not know you. So you're a Polytechnic engineer, inventor of the carbon footprint assessment, and a High Council for the Climate member. You founded the SHIFT project, which kindly welcomed us. You also launched a consulting firm offering carbon footprint assessments to companies. And on top of all that, you're a tireless popularizer on issues of energy transition and climate change. So to get straight to the point, I'd like us to talk about the state of the world today and about the pretty crazy consequences that climate change is already having and will have on our lives. This year, for the first time, the average global temperature has exceeded 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial period averages. We're now on track to hit 2 degrees by 2050. To illustrate just how much a world at plus 2 degrees has rather unfortunate consequences. You often use the example of the ecosystems that existed in Europe during the last ice age. Can you tell us a bit about that?
First of all, why are we on track to reach 2 degrees and why won't we be able to keep the 1.5 degrees target behind us? It's due to the lingering effects of excess carbon monoxide, once released into the atmosphere. A quick chemistry reminder. Carbon monoxide. 2 is what's called a carbon oxide. And oxides on Earth are generally very stable molecules. An example I often use is dihydrogen oxide. When you say that, people ask, what's that? Actually, it's W. Water is a stable molecule and has existed on Earth for 4 billion years. The same applies to carbon monoxide, 2 once it's in the air. It's stable and can only be removed from the atmosphere by contacting the ground or surface. More precisely, it can either dissolve in the ocean, balancing partial pressure, or be absorbed again by photosynthesis. But for that, it needs an external energy input. Since photosynthesis requires photons, it needs outside energy, otherwise it doesn't happen on its own. And so, once we've added carbon monoxide 2 to the atmosphere, the excess carbon monoxide 2 has a residence time, a damping time, which is extremely long. Remember, if we stopped emissions tomorrow morning, the carbon monoxide 2 we've added will take over 10,000 years to disappear from the atmosphere. On timescales relevant to us from a decade to a century, to limit warming to a given value, the only thing to do is not to add too much carbon monoxide 2 to the atmosphere. Atmospheric emissions must stay low, and the timing of carbon monoxide to release, whether next year or in 15 years, is not very important. With the carbon monoxide 2 we've already put into the atmosphere. On average, over 10 years, we've already seen about 1.3 degrees of extra warming. But if we look at the last 12 months, we've actually hit 1.5. Because of the earlier mentioned inertia, now we only need to emit a small amount into the atmosphere each year. It's at 1.5 and we'll stay there. We've already passed 1.5. And to not go over 2 degrees, global emissions would have to decrease by 5% per year starting tomorrow morning, so that the integral, if I can use that term here, the total emissions from now until the moment it stops does not exceed it. Which means the atmosphere will retain an additional greenhouse effect that's low enough so that warming doesn't exceed 2 degrees. As I was saying, since we can't quickly remove excess carbon monoxide 2 from the atmosphere once it's there, well, the total amount of carbon monoxide 2 we can still add before reaching 2 degrees corresponds to a decrease of 5 per year from now on, and 5 per year means 5 in a single year. That's what we had during COVID, so we'd basically need another COVID every year. After COVID, air traffic should not return to its original level. Simply, we add another layer on top. Road traffic shouldn't return to its original level. And then we add another layer on top of that, and so on. So every year, for 25 years, and that goes on for several decades. Another alternative is to destroy the industrial infrastructure of a major country every year, because when, in 1945, the industrial infrastructure of Germany and Japan was destroyed. Global emissions also dropped by 5 that year. So we have a rough idea of what it means to reduce by 5 per year. And we can clearly see that today, even when we talk about transition, we are still light years away from moving at that pace globally on the planet. That's why some say unless there's a disaster like a meteor strike, nuclear war, pandemic, or economic collapse, who knows? A 5% reduction per year is something we have little chance of achieving, so keeping to 2 degrees is a huge challenge. So the example I often use to help people understand just how much there are to, which one do I use? There's a first one, which isn't the one you mentioned, but I'll mention it anyway. And then after that, I'll come back to the comparison with glacial air. The first example I often use is our own body. So why do I often use our own body? Because the climate system is a complex, constrained, and non-linear physical system. Can you elaborate a bit? It's complicated. There are many compartments involved in the climate system, and there are many forcing elements that can play a role. The sun's strength, carbon monoxide, 2 in the atmosphere, and the ocean's saltiness can all vary. Currents may change over time. Anyway, it's a complex system. It's regulated because there are all sorts of homeostatic mechanisms that interact with each other. There's a great book called The Gaia Hypothesis by Lovelock, subtitled The Earth is a Living Being, which explains this well. It explains that Earth is controlled by many homeostatic processes, similar to how our bodies keep a temperature of 37 degrees. The levels of all sorts of hormones, minerals, and so on in our blood are also regulated. So all of that is regulated. And on Earth, there are lots of things that are regulated too, and these homeostatic phenomena are, by definition, controlled processes. So we have plenty of them in the climate. Finally, it's non-linear because physics equations aren't linear, so the climate system remains non-linear, even with some linear warming approximations. For example, we know that 1 more unit of greenhouse effect generally means 1 more degree. So there's a bit of linearity, but that's just at first order. But our body is also a complex system with lots of regulation and dependency phenomena, and it's non-linear. For example, if our internal temperature rises by 1 degree, that's the increase I refer to. We're not anxious and feeling bad, but it might prevent me to some extent from, well, I don't feel very anxious at 30 degrees C, I can still do this interview. Maybe I'd say more silly things, but with less energy, so I'd be more audible. But in any case, it doesn't fundamentally change my nature. If my internal temperature goes up by 5 degrees C, I don't just miss 5 interviews, I'm dead. Well, it's exactly the same for the climate. I'm saying that when we face a complex, nonlinear, and regulated phenomenon like this, the internal changes in the system are not proportional to the rise in temperature, but they evolve much faster than the rise in temperature. The system becomes disorganized much faster than the rise in temperature. That's it. That's what I want to make clear. Here's how it compares to the Ice Age. We can reconstruct past temperatures through isotopic analysis of oxygen and hydrogen found in ice cores from Antarctica. The explanation is as follows, if I may use these somewhat complicated terms. When water evaporates, isotopic fractionation of oxygen and hydrogen is proportional to the evaporation temperature. In other words, warmer temperatures cause water vapor to carry more heavy isotopes, which then condense, precipitate, and become snow on the Antarctic ice sheet. By drilling into the ice sheet and analyzing oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 or deuterium to hydrogen ratios, we can reconstruct something that resembles the planetary temperature at the time the ice was formed. And that's how we can reconstruct the fact that during the last ice age, at the coldest point of the Quaternary, meaning the last million years, we specify mid-latitudes because the tropics change little during ice ages, while mid-latitudes and the poles change significantly. At the peak of the last ice age, 20,000 years ago, the temperature was only 4 degrees lower on average worldwide than it was during the pre-industrial era. So the concept you mentioned earlier actually has a definition. In climatology, it's the average global temperature between 1850 and 1900. It's a double integral, meaning I take the temperature at every point on the globe at every moment, and over 50 years. And I take the average of that, and that's called the pre-industrial value. Well, the temperature during the last ice age was 4 degrees below that value, just 4. So what I'm saying is that from this we can clearly understand that a 2-degree rise in the global average will eventually cause consequences in the long run. I mean in the long run, I'll explain later, because there are major imbalances. So why do I say long run? Because a good part of the consequences don't appear instantly when the temperature rises by 1.5 degrees. We're now seeing high spruce tree mortality in France, and this is only the beginning. Even if we stabilize today's climate, mortality will still rise. Once we stabilize global temperature rise at 2 degrees. Several tens of % of the French forest will die, though not immediately, since trees have reserves. But year after year, too dry, too hot, after a while, even the 100-year-old oak ends up dying, so that's how it is. The idea is that you have to understand that these 2 degrees, it's not instantaneous once the temperature has warmed up by 2 degrees. For example, it takes more than a millennium for the oceans to adjust to a new temperature. Why? Because it takes time for the heat to spread into the depths and for all the water that can expand to actually expand, because that's what happens with the oceans. When you heat water, it expands. It takes 1,000 years for the polar ice caps to reach temperature equilibrium and release all the water they can by melting and calving icebergs. It's the same. You have to wait 1,000 years or more.
Assuming we reach plus 2 degrees by century's end, sea level rose by 60 cm and in quotes only 80 cm more. If we're at plus 4, because the inertia is so crazy that there's not a huge difference and you have to look much further ahead. For once,
at plus 4, it could exceed 50 meters in the long run.
Over several centuries?
Over several centuries, even up to 1,000 years, but over several centuries, yes. Even at 1.5 or 2 degrees, several meters of sea level rise are already inevitable and will eventually occur. Cities are often centuries old. Marseille, for example, dates back to ancient times. A few centuries? Well, that's a long time for you and me, but on the scale of an urban settlement, it's not that long. And we can clearly see that if the sea level rises by 10 meters, there are quite a few cities, especially all the historic port cities, that are definitely going to have some problems. Moreover, humans have historically settled in plains because that's where it's easy to farm, and coastal plains are especially sought after. Simply put, we historically had arable land and communication. Because in ancient times, the only way to transport heavy loads was to be near water. The great rivers when we were inland and the sea when we were... In ancient times, port cities were the largest since only they could support extensive trade. They imported many goods, allowing them to sustain a large population. So that's why, historically, human populations have liked to settle near the coast. It's not just because people like to watch the sunset on the beach. There's actually a biological and geographical reason for it. I'd say that's where it was easy. So 2 degrees Celsius equals half a deglaciation, and as I mentioned, it's not linear. So 2 degrees Celsius isn't nearly as bad as 4 degrees Celsius, possibly 50 to 100 times less serious, but it's still something very, very significant. Another comparison I often use is the global temperature change over the last 10,000 years, excluding recent warming, which has been nearly zero. It was only a slight temperature change, which explains why our species settled. Because during deglaciation, the climate was variable, with temperatures around 4 degrees Celsius. You can't settle somewhere and then start cultivating species and domesticating animals. And then, bam, 3 centuries later, it's not at all the same species that are adapted anymore. Quite simply because the climate conditions changed. So actually, we had to wait for the climate conditions on Earth to stabilize for our species to settle down and develop agriculture. That matches the end of the last deglaciation, 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. And at that moment, the climate became remarkably stable for 10,000 years, and we are the direct heirs of that. Without 10,000 years of stable climate, 8 billion people wouldn't exist. There wouldn't be the internet, there wouldn't be the conquest of the moon, and there wouldn't be presidential elections. None of that would exist because there wouldn't be a sedentary humanity.
What did Europe look like at -4, and what might it look like at +2? Right now, we're just starting to feel the effects of a +1.5 -4. There were 2-kilometer thick ice sheets over all of Scandinavia and North America, and we had relatively arid steppes. There were no trees all the way to southern Spain, but in a world 6 degrees warmer, or even just 2 degrees, what would that look like? There are mountain ranges all the way up to Scandinavia, and the entire Mediterranean region is arid. Do we have any ideas, any models that can predict what that world might look like? Over a longer period of time,
there are 2 separate questions. What might the world look like once we've returned? The balance?
My question was what a balance at +2 looks like.
What does the world look like? During the transitional period, when temperatures have risen but ecosystems haven't yet adapted to the new conditions. The second question is, what kind of world will we live in? Because for the ecosystems to balance with the new temperature, it takes decades, or even longer, for the ocean to balance with the new temperature. As I said, it's over 1,000 years. When the ocean erodes land, terrestrial ecosystems shift to marine ecosystems. It's not exactly the same. It changes the rainfall patterns, and the rainfall patterns can also change. Because local water reserves can take time to disappear once they're gone, there are also feedback phenomena. Everyone knows water falling in the Amazon center has been recycled many times. Since leaving the ocean, it has repeatedly fallen and re-evaporated. Without vegetation to re-evaporate it, it can't continue. So these changes are slow changes. And actually, that's really it. That's the question that's mainly going to concern us. The question of a world, once the balance has shifted to more than 2, is an interesting theoretical question. I'll try to answer it. I can state what I know and don't know about the question. But on the other hand, the world we're going to live in isn't that one, right? The world we're going to live in is the one that's still balancing itself with the new rise in temperature. And that might be less fun. For example, an oak tree doesn't mature sexually until age 50, which means that in a rapidly changing climate, you have to be sure that the acorn that sprouts here will produce new acorns again in 50 years. So when the acorn sprouts, the climate shouldn't be too hostile yet for the next 50 years to stop the oak from maturing and producing acorns again and so on. And then an acorn is heavy, no pun intended. And so by the time a jay comes to get it and carries it away, it's not something that's going to move 50 kilometers. Unlike grasses, for example, which are annual plants with seeds that can spread for kilometers. So those are species that will migrate very easily. Oak trees, they don't migrate easily at all. Of course, humans can help a little. They can now plant oaks in Scandinavia. But if I plant it today, the conditions might not be right for it to grow. So it's hard to answer, because the two questions are, what does it look like once it's in equilibrium? And what does it look like during the transition period? Actually, the two questions are connected. You can't answer the second one without having some idea about the first. That's what I wanted to say. So, a 2-degree world, and I'll end by saying at equilibrium. Me, I don't really know what it looks like because I'm not able to, well, there are parts of it that I know what they look like. The ocean has risen by 5 to 10 meters, maybe even more. Because today there's a question about the instability of West Antarctica and the instability of the Greenland ice sheet. No one knows for sure due to conflicting numbers. What fraction of these ice sheets will have melted, or more precisely, will have disintegrated and produced lots of icebergs? For the sea level, it's the same in the ocean. In the long run, we don't know either. There are people who have models of ice dynamics, competing ones, and so on. There are observations that suggest this, except that, since it's also nonlinear, just because it's happening like this today doesn't mean it will happen like this tomorrow. Anyway, that's it. It's the subject of an expert debate. In the worst case, we're looking at a rise of a few to several dozen meters based on how much of these ice sheets melt, which will eventually melt, break apart, or collapse, and so on. Similarly, in climate models, it's much more difficult to assess changes in precipitation patterns than to assess changes in average temperature. Why is it more difficult? Simply because of basic physics. Once I have the extra energy sent by the additional greenhouse effect on Earth, and I have basically the heat capacity of the atmosphere, the ocean, and the first few dozen centimeters of soil gives me my answer. Okay, I know what the temperature increase is. It's a problem you'd see in high school or college prep.
But how exactly does this chaos reorganize itself?
Where will water evaporate? Where will it fall again? And how will currents reorganize?
I read that with each additional degree, there is 10% less moisture in the soils around the Mediterranean.
Yes, even though each additional degree means 7% more water vapor content in the atmosphere overall.
So,
it's an illustration of the fact that the difficulty is knowing how this surplus will be distributed. And today, the answer that's given is that it's going to be distributed more unequally, both in space and in time. There will be stronger monsoons, heavier rains, and longer droughts. Some areas will become more arid.
And regions that get wetter or are deserts now, but would become what then?
Except that it's just bad luck. The regions that will become wetter are mostly further north, so that's where the conditions for vegetation today aren't necessarily the most favorable. It'll become more favorable and warmer with more to come. But these areas have permafrost that can melt and destabilize the soil. There are forests that become drunk, as they say in Russia. When permafrost melts, the conifers growing on it begin to lean. You have to understand that we're conducting a full-scale experiment for the first time. And everyone who has done physics experiments and is listening to us knows very well that when you do an experiment for the first time, a complicated experiment for the first time, the chance of accurately predicting what will happen, well, it's not one. A few examples from 2 years ago. I'm unsure of their current status. It was observed that climate warming tends to decrease the rainfall that occurs over Lake Gatun, which is the lake that supplies fresh water for the locks of the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is mainly a lake connected to the sea by 2 canal sections. To avoid making the lake water salty, we use fresh water for the locks. If rainfall decreases, we have to reduce the number of lock operations during the day. 2 years ago, the Panama Canal had to have daily lock operations, though I'm unsure of the current status. It's a route carrying 6% of global trade, which is kind of funny. Rainfall in Panama, a small country by France's standards, POF, affects 3% of global trade. The broad consequences of global warming, those are pretty easy to explain. But when it comes to speculating about what might happen at a specific moment in a precise location on the globe, it gets much more complicated. And when we try to move on to practical applications like what we do at Carbon 4 when we work on adaptation, actually we have to create scenarios, meaning we have to do some. And if this happens, what do I do? And if that happens, what do I do? Because there's no crystal ball in which we can completely predict what will happen. For Mr. Dupont in Paris, 14th District on July 3rd, 2048, that's impossible and will remain unknown.
I read that this year, 80% of cereal crops in Spain were lost because of the drought. Stress, the heat wave that arrived earlier than expected.
I don't have any figures about what happened in Spain this year. I haven't done my homework on that yet, but there was a year in previous years when they lost half. They also lost half of their olive harvest. There were even thefts of olive branches, making them a target for thieves. Olive oil prices have risen sharply. What about Spain? I don't have it in mind, but on the other hand, I can say that for cocoa and coffee, the price of Robusta and the price of Arabica have already multiplied. Robusta, it's up by 5 in recent years. And that's mainly due to droughts happening in coffee-producing areas that are suited to this species. That's because coffee is grown in slightly cool areas at high altitudes. It also needs humidity. With global warming, it's getting warmer, and some places aren't humid enough now. And I think it's in Vietnam where there have been major problems. Same for Brazilian oranges. Brazil is a huge producer of oranges, the world's largest exporter of oranges. And Brazil has now, for many years, had endemic droughts to the point that, for example, Brazil's hydroelectric production has peaked about 10 years ago, if I recall, and since then it's stagnated or declined. And there is a real question being raised, by the way, about the Amazon rainforest because of this, because of the drought that's happening over there.
Of all the unpleasant things, one really blows my mind, and I don't think we talk about it enough. It's the fact that higher temperatures than today, combined with high humidity, create, I don't know what to call it, heat bubbles that can be fatal in the long term. Can you explain to us the phenomenon behind this?
Wet temperature, yeah.
And how many people will be affected? I saw some maps that I found absolutely frightening, where you can see a part of India, actually a third of India, so that might represent, roughly speaking, 500 million people. A part of Southeast Asia, which for several weeks a year is in these kinds of rather extreme climate situations. So that means you can't survive unless you're in the shade with air conditioning.
So I'm going to take this opportunity to make a digression that I wanted to make earlier, but since I'm old and I lose my train of thought, I didn't do it. About the fact that today we're just starting to see the consequences of climate change. Well, no, we're not just starting. But since we still live in a world full of energy, we can handle it easily. Because as long as we have plenty of energy, if it doesn't rain enough, we irrigate and eventually we desalinate seawater. If we don't have enough to eat here because nothing grows, we bring it from somewhere else where things still grow because we have trucks that require energy. If a hurricane leaves us without drinking water, we just deliver bottled water by helicopter, plane, or truck. So actually, we have to realize that our energy abundance today gives us the means to deal with the first consequences of climate change without too many problems. If a fire starts, we deploy fire trucks, water bombers, helicopters, and sprayers. All that needs energy, and rebuilding quickly after damage also takes energy. In fact, we have to realize that the industrial civilization causing climate change is also, in the short term, giving us the means to respond to these first signs. Well, not to everything. Industrial civilization doesn't allow us to rebuild the corals that are dying. But who cares? Do people listening mind that 15 corals died? The people who go diving, well, fine, they'll do something else. It's not vital. It bothers the fishermen who no longer catch fish in the coral reefs. We don't care because it's not us. That sounds cynical, but that's how most people react. The first consequences are here and very real. But today, the abundance of energy means it doesn't bother us in our daily lives, because we are able to control environmental conditions well enough, even if they vary for now, so that it's not too harsh.
In developed countries, but in Pakistan it's different.
Absolutely. In developed countries, and even in Pakistan, it doesn't kill half the population. Life expectancy continues to rise on Earth. In fact, the average age at death keeps increasing around the world. That's it, life expectancy keeps increasing on Earth. So actually, for now, it's not a more powerful adverse phenomenon than energy abundance, which goes in the opposite direction. There you go, that was just it, the long digression.
And we'll come back to energy at length. No worries, we'll get to it later. So I'll go back to the bubble of...
So, what is wet bulb temperature? As I said earlier, we need to regulate our temperature at 37 degrees. As long as the air is below 37, it's easy. We warm up our body by burning a good part of what we eat, 90% of what we eat, that's what it's for. If we were cold-blooded, we'd only need to eat 10%. It would be the external sun that would warm our body, and we could use everything we eat for mechanical energy. That's why the crocodile eats less often than us. Thankfully, that's true. If the outside temperature starts to rise above 37 degrees, then I start at 37, and then to cool down, we need to get rid of heat in another way than just by contact with the surrounding air. So we can imagine radiating infrared, which is what we do a bit at the surface of our skin, and then we can also imagine evaporating water, because at that point it's the latent heat that helps cool our body. In dry air above 37 degrees we sweat, the sweat evaporates, and that keeps us cool enough to stay at 37 degrees. If the air is too humid, sweat can't evaporate, so we produce sweat but don't cool down. And so we're at risk if we're in hot and very humid air. In a hammam, staying too long can dehydrate you and cause fatal hyperthermia. But it's easy in a hammam. You open the door and get out, no problem. If the environment turns into a giant hammam, too hot and humid, there's no escape. And at that point, the outside conditions can start to become very dangerous for your health, even deadly.
These are conditions that already exist today, but only for relatively short periods of time.
Exactly, for brief periods and in more limited areas. And the fear with global warming is that there will be a significant number of areas in the world. India, a part of Southeast Asia, a part of Equatorial America that are becoming, and a small part of China. If my memory serves me right, so basically we're talking about 1 billion, more than 1 billion people, that's not nothing, who find themselves in areas where for a good part of the year the outside conditions can potentially become deadly or very dangerous for health. The latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report includes striking maps showing that even a 2-degree warmer world faces significant impacts. We are already starting to see in equatorial regions a significant number of places where it can pose a real short-term risk for anyone, even healthy people who go outside.
We made a list as long as Elastic Man's arm and probably left out several bad news items. So, are there any that we forgot to mention that you think are really essential and maybe in a slightly cynical way? Will climate change have any beneficial effects for certain regions of the world, or do some countries actually have an interest in it happening? Or in not facing the problem directly? I don't know. I'm especially thinking of the countries in the far north like Russia and Canada. What about those areas? One might imagine those areas will eventually become cultivable, with tundra turning into taiga.
So what we are already seeing, unless I'm mistaken, is that in those countries, crop yields currently tend to increase because it's warmer and so on. There was a time, but I don't know the current situation since I'm not in Putin's or Karnit's head, but there was a time when the northern countries were saying, we're going to drag our feet because climate warming will make lands cultivable that aren't currently, and for us, that's going to give us a competitive advantage. What I know is that's what's happening with Russia right now. That is to say, Russian agriculture is actually doing well, partly because the slight climate warming for now is benefiting it. If climate warming becomes more significant, a large part of the Siberian forest will start to burn, the permafrost will begin to melt, and so on. And then, it's hard to know how to balance the pros and cons between what will be troublesome and what will be beneficial. They will have other problems. Agriculture will become more important, but many oil infrastructures are anchored in permafrost. For the deposits that are in the north of Russia, and all the new deposits are in the north of Russia, it becomes more unstable, the pipelines are likely to collapse, etc. That's a good deal for their economy, especially in a country that lives for 1/3 of its gross domestic product from the trade of natural resources. Canada, I haven't checked Canada's situation. Is there bad news I missed? I forgot a lot, and for a simple reason. Today, the bad news we can discuss is only what we've managed to investigate. How do we conduct investigations when it comes to the future? With models, that is, we create a model that best represents the present, and then we force the model with new conditions. By combining climate and forest models, we can make 3 predictions about forest futures. We are able to couple climate models with agronomic or crop models. So, we are able to say 3 things about the evolution, but that doesn't mean we can predict it. We are just able to say 3 things. No one knows how to couple a climate model with a political stability model, for example. So, I can't say if 50 or 95% of the population lives under a dictatorship in a rapidly changing climate. I don't know, and no one can investigate this. We know that giving up beef and living under a dictatorship are very different. It's better to stop eating beef in a democracy than eat it during war in a dictatorship. No one is able to link a climate model with a conflict model. So we don't know if climate change will trigger wars or not. And since there is no peer-reviewed literature, no studies on these topics, we don't talk about them. Does that mean there's no risk? No, it does exist. The risk exists that climate change could lead to political destabilization. The risk exists that climate change could lead to... So I can give you some cascading examples. Consider Germany. Climate change lowers the Rhine's water level, halting German exports since southern Germany's industrial goods ship via the Rhine. Significant decline in the German economy, rise of the far right because of that, and Germany starts doing whatever it wants. Then eventually one day slams the door on Europe, or to reunite the Germans decides to confront the Russians. This all stems from my fictional scenario about the Rhine lowering, which is a climatic factor. Has anyone published a peer-reviewed model combining all these phenomena? No one has agreed. So, does that mean the risk I mentioned isn't real? No, actually, you have to understand the very technique of modeling and peer-reviewed literature, which is an excellent system. I'm not at all saying that it's a bad system. However, it has a key limitation. It can only discuss things evaluated by this system. For everything else, you have to turn to fiction writers. And at that point, there are as many outcomes, as many possible possibilities as there are in the imagination of fiction writers. Even within physical limits, billions of possibilities exist. And besides, in my opinion, that's one of the problems we're facing today. In order to take action, you need to have solutions. But sometimes you also need to scare yourself a little. And I think today we're scaring ourselves. If risks seem manageable or acceptable to us, then yes, to a point. Technically, if crops don't grow, we irrigate. So what's the issue? The ocean is nearby. We'll use solar and nuclear energy for desalination and irrigation. And actually, the fact that we've only modeled certain compartments, simply because that's all that's technically accessible in a way. Because a plant model, we know how to make one, but it limits us by design in being afraid of things that are unknown worlds. I want to say, for me, what scares me is exactly what I just mentioned. What scares me is war, dictatorship, collapse, and the loss of freedom. The cascading events that suddenly disrupt everything, that's what scares me. The more volatile and unstable the system is, the greater the risk of discontinuity, divergence, and something happening that we really won't like. Not to mention that this isn't the only instability we have to face now. So, all the instabilities we have to face now have a common root, which is the abundance of our species and the significance of predation per individual. Since it's the same phenomenon, we could discuss it at length. Which, for example, gave rise to financial instability? It's basically the same. Hiatus causes financial instability. The difference between our expectations of future physical possibilities decades ago and the reality today, that's where it comes from. That's where debt fundamentally comes from. As a man I really like, who does almost the same job as me, says very well in the United States. Money is a claim on energy, and debt is a claim on future energy. And if there isn't enough future energy, the debt increases. So actually, we can connect all these things, and right now, we're facing instabilities that are adding up. There's a virological instability. We just experienced COVID. The next one might be just as contagious, with an incubation period of 8 to 10 days and perfectly lethal. Well, if we have to deal with this, now that we've gathered everyone in the empty spaces, all these instabilities actually add up. And it's in this world that we'll have to evolve. So I'll say it again. Abundant energy is what allows us, in the short term, to keep these instabilities under control. But it will only last for a while.
Let's talk a bit about energy. You said earlier that over the last 5,000 to 6,000 years, basically, the average global temperature has fluctuated around the same level.
What about the time before the last 150 years?
In the pre-industrial era, atmospheric carbon monoxide 2 concentration was 280 parts per million. And today we're at about 420. The ones responsible for this are us, who have burned fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, and as a result, everything we call progress. Transportation, agriculture, industry, and healthcare all rely on this. Could you explain a concept I find powerful? To really grasp, to get a sense of this ability these energies have to transform the world, you often use the example of energy slaves. I can let you talk about that.
Yes, I created a new energy unit called the slave equivalent. It's the slave equivalent worth 100 kilowatts, but why 100 kilowatts? Because a simple calculation shows that's roughly the mechanical energy a person can generate through physical labor. In a year, my equivalent effort is like someone showing what they would do. 1,000 meters of elevation gain per day. When you do 1,000 meters of elevation gain, you provide about 0.25 kilojoule of mechanical energy. So if I do that for 365 days, let's say 400 days in a year for the sake of estimation, that gives me kilowatts at the end of the year. Well, we're still working hard. The calculation I did is as follows. I looked at the amount of energy used per person per year on a global average. So I take all the energy we use on Earth, I divide it by the world population. I found that the average person uses just over 20,000 kilowatt of energy a year. But using 20,000 kilowatt doesn't mean I'm literally plugged into the power grid, or that someone is going to fill my tank with oil, like I open my mouth and they pour oil in, or that they're going to inject a gas pipe into my right ear. Using energy means having a machine work for you. Because I put oil in my car, electricity in my fridge, or in the rolling mill, who will have made all the steel objects I use, or who will have made all the machines that will then make my clothes? So, consuming energy involves transformation rather than actual consumption or production, since energy itself transforms instead of being used up.
See benefit fully from its transformation?
It's benefiting from the transformation it has enabled, and this transformation was carried out in a converter that is outside the body. It's not our own body. So, actually the history of humans is that as time has passed, since we are accumulative and lazy, like all animal species, like many animal species, well, we have tried to make machines work more and more in our place. First we use slaves, then draft animals, and later renewable energies like sailing ships and water mills to work for us. For the last 2 centuries, engines have worked for us. Internal combustion and steam engines are 2 engine types still in use today. Both of them, since all coal and gas power plants are steam engines, and we've put all these machines to work for us. And when I look at the energy used by the fleet of machines serving each individual on Earth, I take the energy consumed by all the machines and divide it by the number of people. That's how I arrive at my famous 20,000 kilowatt per person per year, showing the same level of environmental transformation. If we didn't have machines and we use slaves, I take my slave equivalent of 100 kilowatts and I divide 20,000 by 100, and that gives me 200. So it's not an exact division, because first, the energy I take from the environment, a good part of it provides me with heat, and not directly mechanical energy, whereas here 100 kW is mechanical energy. Some situations require energy for services humans can't do with their legs, but can with their arms. For example, making clothes with your legs is complicated, whereas we still need our hands and so on. I'm roughly estimating by saying I'll do this at 100 per slave. So that means in a world without machines, that is, a world without the energy to power machines. Because if there are machines but no energy, it's as if the machines are useless to us. In a world without fossil energy, which makes up most of the 23,000 kilowatt per person per year I mentioned. Without fossil energy, we wouldn't have as many machines per person. And to enjoy the same environmental benefits, equal amounts of clothes, housing, cars, and so on. At first approximation, each person would need about 200 slaves. In France, it's about 600, and that's for the average person, not the upper class. For the upper classes, it's closer to 1,000 to 2,000, so we're all potential slave owners. That's exactly my point. It's that the fleet of machines today serves our wildest desires. It's like having energy slaves, not just 3, but hundreds.
To illustrate this point, I'll show you a short video. I use the same scale. What did Jean-Marc say? And what if we take the world record for push-ups, during which a strong guy, just look at him, does 3,249 in 1 hour? We see that his effort produces a work output equivalent to what can be provided by burning only 10 centiliters of oil. And I also came across this video that you probably know very well, Jean-Marc, where we see Robert Forsman, who is the world champion in track cycling. So his thighs are easily as wide as my torso. And he agreed to try powering a toaster that uses 700 watts to toast a single slice of bread. So when you see his face, you can tell he's not about to cook any lasagna. By the way, you can have fun calculating that it would take 180 Roberts sweating blood and tears on their bikes for an hour to keep it running for that long. A 1-ton gas car and 43,000 Roberts are needed to match a Boeing 737's power in flight. Actually, we're really weak without this extension.
What about the fleet of machines? We embodied it in the endless world, but I was already doing that before in my lectures and classes and in the Iron Man suit. In fact, these machines give us superpowers. They fly us at 10,000 meters in a plane and move us at 300 km/h by train. They allow us to go on vacation with our luggage, grandma, and the dog, that's called a car, and even before that, they let us travel at 90 kilometers per hour, a speed our legs could never achieve daily. They allow us to make our clothes, which now cost us just a few euros to buy something to wear. They allow us to eat for almost nothing. You should know that in France, only 1% of what we earn goes to paying for food production. Farmers who grow the food get only 1% of our earnings. The rest covers packaging, transportation, processing, stores, banker profits, advertising, and dividends. Everything comes out of food. Well, that's 13 out of 14. So 1 out of 14 is what goes to farmer 1.5. To be more precise. 100 years ago, people spent 25% of their income on food, which was just raw products. There were already canned goods, chocolate bars, and similar items then. But most of what people ate was potatoes, leeks, flour for making bread, and bread bought nearby. Then we made frishti with it. So actually, we went from 25, not to 15, but rather to 2. In a century, food prices dropped tenfold thanks to our energy slaves. The tractors, the combine harvesters, the fertilizers, the pesticides, the silos, the trucks, the refrigerated containers, all of that made it possible, actually, the overall power of all the machines that serve everything we do. Well, we embodied it in the endless world, in the Iron Man suit. This gives us superpowers and lets us control our environment in ways impossible with just our muscles. Human strength lies in their brains, not muscles. We're weaker than most animals. Now, since we sit so much, we're even weaker than before. But that's just how it is. You have to understand that what shapes our lives today is this extraordinary armor made of machines that work for us. And that gives us, once again, the ability to make use of our environment. This is truly extraordinary compared to our ancestors' experiences and to any animal species.
This armor is beginning to crack.
So this armor is slowly starting to have 2 problems. The first is that it needs a lot of energy to function. And now, locally and regionally, we're starting to face energy supply problems. And in a few decades, the problem will become global. And then it's also starting to crack because it's beginning to take the blows from major transformations. Even the armor I mentioned earlier today, energy helps us handle the initial effects of global warming in the short term. But one day, even this armor will no longer be strong enough against the large-scale disruptions that we are likely to face today.
Because we talk a lot about oil, since it's the easiest energy to transport and maybe also to transform. Maybe we'll talk a little later about globalization and the role it plays in all this. I think we're around 100 million barrels of oil burned per day. It's absolutely enormous. But geology is stubborn, the reserves are finite, so it's hard to know exactly when the tap will run dry. Do we have any idea anyway?
I'll start with the conclusion since I've been interested in oil. For about 20 years, oil geologists... Who did I discuss the issue with? in a context where I knew they had few conflicts of interest, such as being semi-retired or retired. They told me that the global peak of oil production would be around 2020, give or take 5 years, at 100 million barrels, give or take 5 million. That was 20 years ago.
But without taking shale oil into account, which...
Including shale oil, the peak was in 2018. So maybe we'll briefly go back above the 2018 level. Well, the analyses we've done at the Schiffer project show that production should stay not far from the 2018 level, a little above, a little below. For now, we're a little below. It's still been 7 years that we've been below, but just a little below. Until around 2030, and after that, it should start to drop sharply. That's the analysis we have at the Schiffer project, and it should start to drop. So, keeping 2025 maintenance levels for 5 more years without strong climate policy. Okay. Here, I'm talking about a world where we don't care about the climate and we're only subject to constraints. What oil companies call below ground, meaning what happens underground. Our will isn't a factor here. As long as we can dig and keep going, we do it, we pump. So why can't this continue forever? It takes between 50 and 400 million years to make oil, though a small part can take as little as 5 million years. On relevant timescales like a century, it's not renewable. And we start with an initial stock that's given once and for all, and everyone knows that if you have an initial stock in a closet, that's given once and for all. You can't remove a bit more from the closet daily, or even take out as much as you did the previous day each time. Indefinitely, everything you can take out of the closet will one day reach a maximum, and if you wait long enough, will eventually reach zero, because there will be nothing left in the closet. So, oil isn't as simple as flour in a closet, but the comparison makes sense. So, the oil we can extract from the ground. We can mathematically prove a simple theorem that I still remember how to prove. That its annual extraction will reach a maximum and will be zero at infinity. So, it will decline over time. We can't mathematically prove if the maximum will be reached due to geology, our will, or an unrelated phenomenon independent of us, not involving oil. A pandemic, crisis, war, possibly humanity's terminal decline. Because we become too inbred, we don't have enough sperm. What do I know? There aren't enough daycare centers. Anyway, I have no idea. Or will this decline be strictly due to the limitation of the amount of oil? I have no idea, but what is certain is that it will happen, and I repeat it as of today. So, regarding what is called conventional oil, that is all oil that comes from rock reservoirs, excluding shale oil and Canadian oil sands, the peak was in 2006 or 2008. If I add what we call condensates, and if I add shale oil and oil sands to date, the peak is in 2018. After that, there are several regions worldwide where we know the peak has already passed. The North Sea in 2000, Africa as a whole in 2009, Mexico in 2005, Asia to date. In 2015, I am 501.
I once found a paper that was mind-blowing. It said that if Saudi Arabia's domestic consumption kept growing at the rate it is today, it would be a net importer of oil by 2070.
That makes no sense. They can't, because there won't be anywhere to buy it from, since physically elsewhere it's going to run out. That's an important point. It's important to understand that in Europe we're not dependent on the production of other countries, but on the exports from other countries. When you look at countries that passed their peak some time ago, you realize that between the time they reach their production peak and the time they stop exporting, the gap is quite short. If I look at Indonesia, for example, between the time Indonesia reaches its production peak and the time it stops, and at the moment it reaches its production peak, it was still exporting 70% of its oil, and by the time it became an importer, less than a few decades had passed. In 2005, Mexico exported half its production, but 15 years later, it exported nothing. Production was cut in half, and it keeps everything for itself. The oil exporting countries, oil on which we are completely dependent, since France imports 99% of its oil, and the European Union imports 97% the oil producing countries. The analysis we did at the Shift is that by 2050, their production should be cut by almost half. This means their exports could be reduced by 5 to 20 times or possibly eliminated entirely. So the European Union's oil use will drop by 5 to 20 times regardless of climate concerns, leading to a rapid decline. What effect will that have? If the economy isn't ready, many will become impoverished. Because goods will be less able to circulate, people will be less able to travel, and tourist areas will be less easily served. So people over there will have fewer jobs, or they'll be paid less, and so on. Clearly, everything I mentioned indicates an economic contraction. And this contraction of the economy could happen fast enough that it becomes politically unmanageable. This might remind you of some recent news events, and that's also what this trend in oil is telling us. It's that all the prime ministers, potential or otherwise, no matter which political side they belong to, who thinks that once they're in charge, they'll instantly have an easy solution to implement. That this idiot of an outgoing prime minister, whoever he is, didn't find. They're completely fooling themselves. Because that's not what they're going to do at all. They're going to find the situation physically unmanageable, just like their predecessors, unless they implement a smart, well thought out decarbonization. This also raises significant fairness and social justice issues, which are real concerns in this country. In fact, the bottom line is that we're going to suffer the consequences of this forced geological decline in oil. And then, in Europe, gas and coal are added to that, leading to a contraction of the usual economy. And if we haven't invented anything to counter that, well, we're just going to face impoverishment and widespread poverty with successive crises. It's easy to predict the political outcome. It will be chaos. With, on top of that, widespread misunderstanding. Because since we never look at the physical flows of the economy, we just focus on the monetary flows. The people who will be able to truly understand where this comes from will be very few. In a way, we were better prepared intellectually during the oil shocks. Back then, our leaders were war veterans. We were still able to understand what a physical flow was, because we had much more recently come out of a civilization that was deeply involved in it. Before the war, half of France was rural and focused on physical flow. You know, what production and agriculture are and what a stream is and so on. Today, we live in a civilization of city dwellers who are completely disconnected from the flows that keep us alive. So the people who will be able to understand what the deep root cause of this economic slump is, which we feel we can't get rid of. In fact, there are very, very few today, in my opinion, proportionally much fewer than there were a few decades ago. So all this is to say that this decline in oil production is likely to have very significant political drawbacks in Europe, and that's going to be a reality in the coming decades. So about gas. We also did an analysis at Schiffer Project, which shows that very surprisingly, since 2010, gas production from conventional gas fields has not increased. No change. All the growth in gas production since 2010 has been from, unconventional gas fields. It's funny, even I didn't know that. We found out by having access to some specialized databases on the subject. If I take the specific case of Europe, and I'll finish with that then, in Europe. Since 2008, oil imports have been decreasing, and that's a consequence of the peak in conventional oil production since 2005. When the North Sea passed its peak in gas production, gas consumption in Europe suddenly stopped increasing. Overnight, it had been increasing continuously and very rapidly. In 2005, the North Sea peaked, then soon stopped rising and began to decline. And finally, regarding coal consumption in Europe has been declining since the early 1980s. Something that has absolutely nothing to do with climate policy, since there wasn't any at the time. However, it has everything to do with geology. Coal production in Europe peaked in the early 1980s and has declined since. And coal, once you don't have much left in an area, it's complicated to compensate with imports, because coal logistics are very complicated.
Even with plenty left, it's better to leave it underground.
Yes, for the climate, but I mean, even if we don't want to keep it underground, transporting large amounts of coal over long distances is very complicated. In practice, it only works well if it's transported by water, transporting coal by truck between Poland and Brest. We don't do it, it doesn't make any sense. The energy efficiency of the whole thing is way too low because coal is a heavy solid. You said earlier in your question, oil became the dominant energy source because it's easy to handle at room temperature and pressure. Yes, nothing is easier to handle than a liquid. You put it in a tank and carry it everywhere. And besides, it's an energy source with a very high energy density per unit of volume per liter or per unit of weight per kilo. So that's why it became the standard in transportation, exactly, especially in transportation.
Couldn't we say, or at least be tempted to think, that renewable energies will save us, even if the effort will be significant? Is it wind power? Is it solar? Is it also nuclear, even if that's not really renewable? Are they part of the solution, or the solution
Part of the solution, yes, the solution, in the sense that it would be enough to just do that, no? First, remember, we know renewable energies well because they're the only ones we've used. From our species emergence 100,000 years ago until 2 centuries ago, humanity relied solely on renewable energy, proving it was possible. Back then, there weren't 8 billion people and average life expectancy wasn't 60 years. On Earth, there wasn't a car for every person or 1.6 billion cars on the planet. Annual steel production wasn't 2 billion tons, nor was cement 4 billion tons. There weren't trips to Marrakesh for just about 120 euros and so on. None of that existed in this 100% renewable world. Life was very, very different from the life we have today. Mobility was much more limited. People walked about 4 kilometers a day. Today, people drive several dozen kilometers a day on average, and they travel about 10 kilometers a day on average by plane. So that world was really very, very different. Democracy didn't exist much in the world of renewable energies. Is there a cause and effect relationship? I speculated a bit about that in a book I wrote a few years ago, and my answer was, is it possible that there is a link? Democracy first emerged in the ordinary world with Great Britain, which also began the Industrial Revolution and thus experienced earlier growth than others.
Some will say that the Greeks were the Greeks.
Greek democracy was limited to a few thousand free citizens, sitting on top of an army of slaves, so actually the Greeks, they had democratically managed the co-ownership of the nabobs, located in the middle of the flow of slaves. Well, okay, that's easy, but mass democracy didn't exist. So, can we imagine keeping all the achievements of industrial civilization by going back to renewable energies? Actually, that's the question when people ask if renewables can save us. I don't think so, but let's say yes. Wind turbines now generate kilowatt hours more cheaply than fossil fuels. Okay, except that the wind turbines that today produce kilowatt hours cheaper than fossil energies were made with coal, oil, and gas. That means a modern wind turbine is a byproduct. Like my t-shirt, like the electrical outlet over there, like my bike, and like the window at my place. From the industrial apparatus, it's the same byproducts. So today, the demonstration we've been able to make in the world is that we can make cheap wind turbines. In a world where every year we consume more oil, more coal, more gas, and we have an industrial apparatus that is overall bigger. Okay, but does that answer the question of what happens to the price of wind, solar, or a dam? Well, whatever, in a world with only wind turbines and solar panels, just manufacturing them, that's it. No economist has the answer to that. The only thing I can guarantee is that it has nothing to do, in terms of volume and price, with what we know today. I'm not saying we shouldn't build wind turbines and solar panels. However, this is a strong reason not to assume wind turbines and solar panels alone can recreate today's industrial world. As for me, I don't believe that for a second, and when I say I don't believe it for a second, it's a conviction. It's not the result of a mathematical demonstration. These are little bits here and there of considerations that are based on physics. For example, wind is much less dense than oil. Solar radiation is much less dense than oil. Wind and sun are much harder to store than oil, and so on. There are still physical considerations in the end. When we do rough calculations, we realize that the probability of succeeding is close to zero. And besides, if it were that easy to achieve, it would have happened a long time ago.
It would have been done already, just to give you an idea of the scale. Oil produces about 100,000 TDON annually worldwide, while wind and solar together generate around 3,000, something like that.
So I have in mind that oil makes up 30% of the world's energy supply and wind and solar combined. We're around 1%. Yes, that's right. You say 100,000 and 3,000, 100,000 versus 3,000, that's 3. Yes, that's it. We're in the same ballpark. And today, what we've demonstrated once again is that we're able to install more panels and more wind turbines in a world where, at the same time, we're consuming more coal and more oil. So once again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. I'm not being anti-renewable here, I'm being anti-illusion. That's different. So thinking that people will conserve their retirement, their purchasing power, their 6 weeks of paid vacation, well, mine too, my 6 weeks of paid vacation, my retirement, my purchasing power, I'm not opposing. Thinking we'll all keep that in a world with only wind turbines and solar panels, basically windmills. I have doubts. Our theory in the endless world focuses on purchasing power and free time. This results from energy abundance brought by fossil fuels. If renewable energy alone made 6 weeks of paid vacation possible, we would have achieved it in the past 100,000 years we've had renewables. If retiring with just renewable energy was so easy, why didn't it happen sooner? It's been thousands of years. Why didn't it happen earlier? If it was so easy to have distant vacations with just renewables, why is it the same? Our ancestors weren't much dumber than us. Mozart was much smarter than me, Leonardo da Vinci too, Newton as well, and Galileo as well. I mean, why didn't it happen earlier? My answer, to paraphrase Clinton, is it's the kilowatt hour, stupid. It's a physical, energetic reason it didn't happen sooner. So will it save us? No, that's the long answer. Is it useful to do it? Yes, because everything we can do on that level will save us even more effort. So, in terms of consumption restriction, it's a good answer. It's still an idea to use decarbonized energies. Well, not to attack them, but to tap into them. It's not bad at all, because the more we do it, the easier it will make the effort. We shouldn't assume all renewable energies are alike. The renewable energies that have historically been used the most, meaning biomass and hydroelectric, are also the ones that are physically the most controllable, like biomass. Once I have my logs, I burn them whenever I want. So if I want to make steel today, I do it today. And if I want to make steel in 3 weeks, I do it in 3 weeks. And if I want to heat my home with my wood stove today, and if I want to heat my home with my wood stove in 3 weeks, I can do it. Hydroelectricity is simple. Once my reservoir lake exists, I just open or close it as needed for electricity. When it comes to the sun and the wind, it's different. Unless society accepts fixing teeth or trains running only when there's wind or sun, we have to match these energies to the way we now operate in the West, which is that schedules are guaranteed. We started this podcast after meeting a few months ago to plan it. I didn't say I'll come if it's windy or I'll come if it's sunny. SNCF doesn't inform you if the train leaves in windy or sunny weather. People starting work at 9 a.m. as municipal employees aren't informed by City Hall. The municipal service will be open if it's windy or sunny, and school for the kids starts at 8:30, whether there's wind or no wind, whether there's sun or no sun. So we've gotten used to basing the functioning of our society on predictable schedules. And the supplier delivers to the factory on time everywhere. Well, I mean, it's on time everywhere. And so to make society work this way, it forces us to have energy sources that can be controlled. So in a number of cases, we can still accept that the service is provided in a slightly different way. For example, with a well-insulated water heater for evening showers, I don't care if the water heats in the morning or evening. So that's typically an example where, as long as there's some sun at some point during the day, my thing works, no problem. If I have electric transportation and I have oversized fields of solar panels, there's always a bit of solar electricity even in winter. And since I travel every day and the battery recharges every day, it's manageable. But there are uses for which that's less true. For example, continuous industrial production such as aluminum smelting at base load. I can't make it stop without sunlight, that's unmanageable. SNCF uses less electricity at night than during the day, but still consumes electricity daily. So there are plenty of uses for which we can't accept a service interruption. In the current functioning of society at this point, we need to make non-controllable energies controllable. So in renewable energies, there are two main categories, those that are controllable and those that are not. As long as they are controllable, we can have as many as we want. Norway has an electrical system in which it has 100% renewable energy. It's from dams. Norwegians use about 2.5 times more electricity per person than we do in France, unless I'm mistaken. So it works very well because there are 4.5 million of them. In a country that's large, about half the size of France, and is mostly made up of mountains and where it rains a lot. In the southwest of Norway, it rains 4 meters per year, so people are really fed up. He doesn't have any problem. When you're in Belgium, in the flat country that is his own, having lots of obstacles is more complicated. And Germany, in its love for renewable energy, only gets 4% of its electricity from dams. Germany is quite flat, so it can't do better. Even France, with 10-15% from mountains, can't improve either. So we've been using controllable renewable energies for a long time, and the challenge today is whether we can massively use uncontrollable sources like wind and solar. When people mention renewables, that's usually what they mean. They're usable in some situations, but not others. There are ideal and less ideal places to install them, such as wind turbines and areas affecting aerial biodiversity. It doesn't mix well with some birds of prey, with bats, with some common birds, and so on. The question is, how do we decide? Do we say it's not a big deal? It kills a few birds. There are other things that kill a few birds, a few bats, after all. Who cares? Or do we say, no, it's important? Or can we reconcile both? We put them here, not there. Well, there you go. There are plenty of them. As for offshore wind power, it's actually the opposite. Offshore wind power remains a problem for wildlife. But for fish, it's very good because it creates artificial reefs, so it increases the number of fish. How do we decide if a few more fish are worth the birds lost during migration? We just don't know. Let's say, broadly speaking, we need to go all in on all renewable energies. So broadly speaking, all renewables. Anything relevant we can do with it is worth taking. So when I say relevant, that's what I meant by making choices. Because renewables use low density energy sources like wind and sun. You need a lot of collectors to start getting the amounts of energy we use today. Industrial civilization requires many raw materials and much space. So that means that everywhere we put them, we'll have to deal with the drawbacks they bring to those locations. That's why I was saying there's a question to be asked about the locations. Is it better to build huge machines at sea or smaller ones on land? It's easier to maintain on land but more complex at sea, which is farther from cities. Better for fish but not for some birds. But it's not bad. Also, the wind is more predictable and more consistent. So how do we make the decision? We must do everything we can under reasonable conditions, that's obvious. However, even if we do everything we can under reasonable conditions, those reasonable conditions also mean maintaining the stability of the grid. Because wind and solar generate electricity that isn't alternating current, the system produces direct current, so that means it has to be converted. With an inverter that is electronic, high power, and not as responsive or as precise as the control mechanism found in rotating machines, which in turn is a mechanism that very precisely adjusts the frequency and therefore ensures a much more stable frequency on the grid. What happened in Spain, and probably at some point or another, it involved a drop or an increase in frequency. In the end, there was a frequency variation that the grid couldn't handle. Then finally, it seems that afterwards, the Spaniards didn't know how to deal with it properly, and so the problem spread everywhere. Being reasonable can also mean not going so far as to put the frequency at risk. But then, that raises the question of what we do on the side. So that's it. Those are the questions being asked. So anything that's reasonable, yes, the whole definition being what do we call reasonable in light of other criteria, other obligations, other conditions or limits that we have to respect? That's it. That's the question. And then, as I was saying earlier, what about the long-term sustainability of such a system? And that's true for the entire industrial system. As fossil sources dwindle, which are now essential to sustain and produce the system. Nuclear power is the same today. Building a nuclear power plant without the industrial infrastructure that comes from fossil fuels. We don't know how to do it since you need forges, you need transportation and so on. Still, in the end, nuclear electricity avoids the emissions we would otherwise have, just like renewables compared to fossil fuels, and that's an advantage. Nuclear energy, just like fossil fuels, is very dense, so nuclear fission is an extremely dense form of energy. That's why in France we can supply nearly all the country's electricity. With 20 sites, with 20 power plants, that is 20 sites where there are reactors, it's not a lot, it's a very small area, very small and so on. All of that is because it's very dense, but since it's very dense, it means the reaction is very vigorous. And so where it happens, you really have to protect yourself. So you have to put big layers of protection around it in steel, in concrete and so on. Be careful, maybe even a little too careful, but well, maybe we're being overly cautious about this. Nuclear energy has still developed safety requirements that aren't demanded of any other industry. That is, we absolutely don't ask this of the chemical industry, of driving cars, etc., not to mention tobacco. Maintain equal precaution for potential environmental and population impacts. Nuclear energy is a singularity among industrial sectors, but still, it's carbon-free. It's the same here. Anything we accomplish is worthwhile.
But it's not renewable over a long period. We have an idea, at least, for the current power plants that run on uranium-235.
Yes, so that's a real issue. Uranium-235 isn't an issue as long as there are 450 reactors worldwide, but that's only true while that number remains. Nuclear accounts for 10 of the electricity, which makes up 20 of the final energy consumption. So that's 2 of the total. So actually, whether we do it or not doesn't make much of a difference. If we want nuclear to represent 20 or 25 of the world's final energy consumption, or 30 or 50, it doesn't matter.
That's achievable.
Technically, there's no limit. Yes, you just have to build a lot of reactors, except at that point, we'll run into a problem with uranium-235. Because at that point, you absolutely have to switch to nuclear reactors that can use uranium-238 and plutonium. So to the 4th generation. Because without that, we can't deploy nuclear plants on the same scale as the coal power plants we have in the world today.
And that nobody knows how to do today?
We know how to do it. France has already done it. With Phoenix and Super Phoenix, well, Super Phoenix was shut down for political reasons, but Phoenix operated for 30 years at the Commissariat à l'Énergie Atomique without any problems. The Russians have a commercial reactor, a fast breeder reactor, so basically the same model as Super Phoenix, let's say, currently in operation. The Chinese are building one, so for now it's just one, but if we know how to operate one industrially, that means we have a prototype, and so we're able to deploy it.
And with that, it pushes things back a lot.
Yes, we have enough uranium for thousands of years, so we'll eventually focus on other things. But for that, we would need to double our efforts on 4th generation technology starting today, which we're not doing in France. In our wisdom, we've chosen to do the opposite. That's one of the things we can credit our dear president with, among other things. Yeah, energy just isn't his thing. So maybe that's an achievement then. If we want nuclear power to play a very significant role in electricity production for a long time, we absolutely have to deploy 4th generation reactors as quickly as possible. But even that, and even renewables added to it, which is what I want to finish with, won't avoid a very significant effort to reduce material consumption. When we do rough calculations anyway, we'll have to make an absolutely considerable effort, that's it. We'll have to have fewer cars and lighter ones anyway, heat fewer square meters, except traveling shorter distances and so on. That doesn't mean returning to the Stone Age. Let me remind you that the Middle Ages were already considerably more advanced than the Stone Age. People in the Middle Ages already had many skills. It might not even be about going back to the Middle Ages, but it's still about inventing something different from what we have today. And yes, strictly in material terms, it means we'll have fewer things.
For France to become carbon neutral by 2050, we need to triple our current nuclear fleet, double the number of wind turbines installed every decade, and reduce our energy consumption by 40%.
That gives you an idea of the effort involved.
It's a wartime mobilization.
Yes, so at a time when we don't have a prime minister and a bunch of kids in the assembly, it's clear that this kind of plan has little chance of happening.
We hear it more and more often in tech circles, at least I hear it quite often. A narrative claims that the potential upcoming innovations are going to be some kind of golden crutches, which will allow us to continue forever by selling us a future without sacrifice, a future of green growth, powered by the magic of engineers who will eventually find the solution. And around that, there's also often the narrative that revolves like a little tune of geoengineering. For you, are these real solutions to consider that are hiding behind all this? Or are these narratives coming from dangerous apprentices, snake oil salesmen? I didn't want to put the answer in the question.
But this question has 2 parts. Is the bigger question about technological progress. Technology is something that allows us to change everything, well, to revolutionize everything, to solve everything. And besides, what about geoengineering? These are 2 separate questions. So the first one is, will technological progress save us? Well, it depends on what we mean by saving ourselves, and it depends on what we mean by technological progress. If we look a bit at the history of technological progress, our species has been making it for thousands of years. Our species made considerable technological progress by domesticating fire, and made considerable technological progress by harnessing the wind to move boats forward. Magellan's adventure was something of incredible audacity. Compared to climbing Everest today, it was just unbelievable. This guy threw himself completely into the unknown. It was pure recklessness. In fact, so we've been making technological progress for thousands of years, haven't we? This technological progress has allowed us to reduce human pressure on the environment spontaneously, and the answer is no. under what is the probability for technological progress, which is not primarily intended to help us reduce pressure on the environment in the future, does that on its own without us asking for anything? The answer is 0. Okay, that won't happen anymore. When people say artificial intelligence will help us manage the environment better, no. Are large language models made to help us better manage the environment? No, they're designed to help middle schoolers save time on essays. By making them more mindless, students don't notice how. It's going to help us preserve the environment. It's going to help us sort resumes a bit faster and get less tired, we think, when we do research, but that's all. Are there some developments in computing that have benefits for the environment? Yes, among them, obviously. When we have software that helps us better...
The weather model?
There you go, for improved satellite fire detection, etc. Yes, obviously there is a benefit for the environment, but that's in the middle of an ocean of development, which, I mean, when Intel developed the first microprocessors, they were used for some scientific applications in particular. But Intel didn't do it to help the environment. And today, the people who make NVIDIA, their business model isn't about saving the environment. It's about making chips that will be used to do all sorts of things. Virtual universities, online games, once again, large language models after all sorts of things. Technological progress won't give us what we want unless we pursue it. What will save the environment? If we want to save the environment, it has to be a decision, so we have to say that's what we're going to do. And then we let all the developments that go in that direction thrive, and the others, we don't let them thrive. It's as simple as that when we ban research or ban developments for ethical reasons. We've done it before, for example. We decided that we were going to ban research on human cloning. We said we were going to be extremely vigilant about research on stem cells. For this reason, we sometimes say certain things for ethical reasons. We're not going to do it, so it wouldn't be anything new for us to say that. From now on, we will allow developments that are compatible with reducing pressure on the environment to prosper, or even those that have this as their goal. And what about the others? No, that doesn't stop us from being creative, but we are creative in a direction we've decided to take, so yes, that can eventually be done, and at that point indeed. We let the developers of wind turbines and nuclear power plants work. People who develop aquaculture based on plant cultivation to avoid fishing all the fish, we let them work. And then the people who develop rockets for space tourism, we don't let them work. No, but there you go. I don't have a problem with that. We'll always find something to get our brains excited about. If we simply say, let engineers engineer and researchers research, and then, as if by magic, all the developments we make will spontaneously lead us toward reducing the pressure on the environment. I don't believe for a second that will happen. Question about geoengineering. So geoengineering, for those who aren't familiar, these are all the techniques that aim to try to change the energy flows in the climate system so that warming stops, or even to induce cooling. So among those, in the mix, in the few techniques I've seen, there's the idea of placing large mirrors. At the Lagrange point, that is, the point where the attraction from the Earth and the Sun is equal, to prevent part of the solar radiation from reaching Earth, there's the idea of continuously burning sulfur in the upper atmosphere to create sulfate particles, which are reflective particles. There's the idea of seeding the surface of the ocean with iron oxides to promote the growth of phytoplankton, which will capture carbon monoxide too, and so on. So that's the fact. And then on a much smaller scale, there's painting roofs white and so on. So painting roofs white. Personally, I'm for it. It's actually a good idea. The mirrors at the Lagrange point, I did a quick calculation but forgot the result. A few years ago, I calculated how many rockets would need to be launched into space and their impact on global warming to have a significant effect. I said if we want to eliminate the greenhouse effect, which today has added one, well, the radiative forcing. Today, it's one of the incident radiation, so I said to eliminate it, we need to block one of the incident solar radiation. At the Lagrange point, we need a mirror with a surface area about equal to Earth's. A bit less since we're closer to the sun, but it doesn't matter. And then I said, just imagining that we managed to build mirrors that weigh, I don't know, 5 or 10 grams per square meter, which isn't that much. Anyway, we're in a vacuum, so it doesn't matter. I had calculated the number of thousands of tons, millions of tons that would need to be launched into space, and I ended up with a number of millions of rocket launches. I don't recall how many I had, but it was obvious we couldn't do it. It was totally crazy. I believe those techniques will eventually outpace us, making it impossible to achieve them at scale. And besides, they have another drawback, which is that they don't prevent the atmosphere from keeping its extra greenhouse effect, since carbon monoxide too dissipates very slowly. I had it earlier. And so what happens is that the day we are no longer technologically able to maintain this continuous cooling. So the mirror at the Lagrange point, it takes it an asteroid, a comet, a small particle, anything at all, or it deteriorates or whatever. Actually, you always need rockets to keep launching continuously to maintain the thing. That assumes we have a technological base on Earth that allows us to do it, and resources that are abundant enough. So that, the day we don't have any more at that point, and maybe a bit less efficient eventually. Well, in this case, the Lagrange point is so important, the amount of the mirror. For example, with sulfur dioxide, you'd need to keep burning sulfur in the upper atmosphere to renew sulfate particles, which also causes acid rain. What happens when we can't dump sulfur into the upper atmosphere anymore? Suddenly, the climate snaps back to its equilibrium, causing a rapid 2 or 3 degree increase. What does that mean? Actually, it returns to the equilibrium temperature it would have had if no sulfur dioxide had been added to the atmosphere. At that moment, it immediately aligns with its position on the curve based on carbon monoxide, 2 emissions. Additionally, no one knows how this technique will affect the water cycle. It's still much simpler, at least for the beginning of the story. To agree to drive smaller or fewer cars, whether electric or not, and to eat a bit less meat, to consider that vacations on the other side of the planet by plane, well, we can survive without them, and so on. Managing to do that is still much easier than imagining this system. We like to imagine this system because we're fundamentally lazy animals. That's what I was saying earlier.
We saw earlier that imports of oil, gas, and coal in Europe were all declining. Plus, we have no resources. Could it be, paradoxically, that this might actually put us in a slightly more advantageous position than others, insofar as it forces us, in a way, to tackle the problem more quickly? And I want to say that our cities have existed for a long time. They don't have the same road network as the United States. We're not woven into the territory in the same way. We have more trains. I'm trying to see a bit of positivity in that before I let you get into the question about the Americans behind it.
Ideally, yes. But for that argument to hold, we have to overcome the idea that globalization allows us to have all the resources that exist elsewhere without any problem. Today, in fact, this idea that the energy decline we're experiencing in Europe is in itself a sufficient argument to move much more willingly toward decarbonization. It hasn't found its way to the minds of economic and political leaders. It hasn't found its way, so why hasn't it found its way? For 2 or 3 reasons. The first is that the information needed to have an opinion on the situation is information that is rarely relayed by the media. Every day they talk to you about the public deficit, but they don't talk to you every day about the energy availability deficit. In Europe, they talk to you every day. For stock market updates, just listen to France Info in the morning. They provide daily prices. They don't talk to you every day about the level of production or the level of imports. They don't give you the daily oil import statistics. So actually, we live in a world where our attention is not spontaneously focused on physical elements, especially the evolution of energy supply. If we focused on it, it would be more present in people's minds. They'd notice it's declining yearly and think, damn, maybe there's a problem we need to address. Since we don't give this information, some people will say yes, but it's not a big deal. We could have derived data. What price do we pay for oil and gas? If we had a supply problem, prices would be much higher. Since they're not, we don't have a supply issue. And that comes from the idea. I was going to say naive, not naive in the sense that people are stupid, but naive in the sense that it seems like common sense. As the other guy says near your home, it's the famous law. The cheaper it is, the more there is. The scarcer it is, the pricier. And actually, this law doesn't apply to essential commodities for the economy. So this law It applies, for example, to plums or cherries or to handbags, but it doesn't apply to oil. So why does it apply to plums, cherries, and handbags, but not to oil? Imagine a world where plum production falls sharply. Does that stop people from going to work? No. Does that stop people from working?
Except if they only eat plums?
That's pretty rare. Is it? I agree, but we don't know many people who eat only prunes. Does that stop people from working? No. Does it stop people from buying things other than plums? No. So basically, the economy keeps working as before, just with fewer plums. Since the economy and production remain unchanged, incomes stay the same. In economics, production and income are equal in monetary terms, so equal production means equal income. With the same money but fewer plums, plum prices rise. I could have used the example of cherries, it's the same thing. I could have used the example of handbags, it's the same thing. If there are fewer handbags, that doesn't stop people from going to work. If there's less oil, that means fewer oil-powered machines are running. Since the economy is a system of machines that transform resources, that's what I said earlier. Machines drive production. Saying that we all have energy slaves everywhere is the same as saying that what keeps the economic system running is the machines. And besides, indeed, it's the machines that wove this thing. It's machines that grew the cotton for this thing. It's not people. It's machines that transported this t-shirt once it was made. It's machines that dyed this t-shirt. It's machines that offered it to me for sale, a website or a store cash register. Well, machines, everywhere machines. So since it's machines working for us and machines need energy, if there's less energy, there are fewer machines working for us. So if there's less oil, the economic output in volume contracts. As I mentioned, economic output is income. That means our real income, no matter what convention we use for inflation, goes down. So I end up with a product that's less available, oil and income that has gone down. Who can tell me if the new price will be above or below the old one? Well, nobody, we don't know. And actually, that's the reason. What I just explained explains why. Sorry for the repetition, but it gives the answer to the question, which is why. Is it when we look back over the past 150 years? We can't find any link between the amount of oil available for sale and the price per barrel. There isn't the slightest connection. Today, the economic world, the world of business leaders, and the political world continue to believe firmly that if we have to deal with having less oil, the price of oil will rise sharply. That's true in the short term. When Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries announces a 1 million barrel a day cut, the price per barrel jumps. But that lasts a week, a month, 3 months, and then something else happens. And the only thing we can say about the price of a commodity essential to the economy that starts to run short, it's not that its price rises or falls endlessly, but that it becomes volatile. When you look at oil prices over the past 10-15 years, they've just kept zigzagging. And actually, that's the sign that we're starting to have an issue. So to answer the questions in an ideal world, yes, it would be great if the political class and the economic leadership unanimously said to themselves, oh wow, we're starting to feel the heat with the availability of fossil fuels. So we're going to hurry up and come up with something well designed for decarbonizing the economy. We're going to hurry up and make small electric cars, do some social leading, and encourage people to replace their gas cars with electric cars, which incidentally will make it easier to implement low emission zones afterwards. We'll urge people to switch from oil and gas boilers to heat pumps once their homes are insulated. Besides, we're going to make insulation mandatory as soon as there's a building renovation. Finally, we're going to hurry up. Okay, we're going to hurry up and electrify industrial processes as much as we still need to. Maybe not as much as today. We're going to hurry up and revitalize agriculture. We're going to hurry up and do all that because it's our backup plan. It would be ideal if people thought that way, but today, that's not what they're doing, even if we agreed to think that way. Besides, I think that would be a relevant movement for our country because it matches these historical forces. So why am I saying this? France, by contrast, has a historical tradition of excellence in constrained optimization across the economic spectrum. The individual all alone in his corner and the big corporation, so let me elaborate a bit. Historically, we have people who are very good at the individual talent of constrained optimization. That's why we've historically had good pastry chefs, good cooks, good gardeners, good architects, good engineers, good mathematicians. So when it comes to individual talent, we're very good, but we have fewer good physicists. Because now, Nobel Prizes in physics go to people who have done complex experiments, who worked in teams, and who had big budgets. So it's a bit less As a mathematician, you can get funding simply to write equations on paper. So we still have people who are really good. And at the other end of the spectrum, and this goes along with that, we're really good at managing large complex systems. Historically, France has created influential standards like the Betrix system, public service delegation, value-added tax, and more recently, extra financial company legislation. We can create and export smart standards, and moreover, we've often created a world champion. In each of the industries that were complicated, in aeronautics, in nuclear, in trains, in big complicated things, we made a very good hospital system, we made a very good electrical system, we finally did it, that's it. We're good with big complicated things. But solving the problem is a big complicated thing, it's a huge unmanageable mess. So we should go for it, we should dive in because we'd have a competitive advantage since everyone will have to deal with it sooner or later. And for now, the people who are raking in the profits. It's the Chinese, who are also historic competitors in optimizing complex systems, because they're very good at that game too. It's also a nation of engineers.
Why, in your opinion, has their political elite perhaps better understood the scale of the challenge? It's paradoxical since today they produce 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. They consume 40% more coal than the rest of the planet combined, and at the same time...
No, they consume a big 50% of the world's coal.
Last year, they installed 55% of solar panels and now have 1,000 gigawatts of solar capacity, whereas we in the entire European Union have 3 times less.
Half of all nuclear reactors being built are in China, making global nuclear power increasingly Chinese. Perhaps the Chinese, not Électricité de France, will renew the fleet since they can build reactors in 5 years, on schedule and within budget. So why could this be the story? Why, on the other hand, did Europe take such a lead during the Industrial Revolution? Even though the Chinese are just as smart as we are, they're a nation of engineers. In ancient China, the most respected caste members were hydraulic engineers who managed rice field irrigation systems. They were part of the aristocracy. I want to say, not nobles, but well-regarded, highly respected people. In ancient China, I'm not sure why, I'd need to investigate further. It happened a century and a half ago. They fell behind. And now they're getting ahead, so we know they're going to get ahead. Perfit wrote a book called When China Wakes Up, I believe in the 70s, but China actually woke up about 30 years later. So why? I don't know. But what I do know is that today, I want to say, our real competitors are more in China than in the United States. I know you wanted me to talk about the United States, so I'll do that now. The United States, for me, they're at the opposite end of the spectrum.
They're victims of their own wealth.
You need to consider the context of the United States creation. It was founded through violence in a vast world. They arrived in a land that was extremely richly endowed. From 1859 to 1939, the United States was the world's top oil producer for a century. And they became so again. They are the leading producers, absolutely, and they became so again. But for a century, they were the world's leading oil producers. You have to understand, before the war, they produced, if I'm not mistaken, 1/3 of the world's steel. Did the United States win the war because of its strong industrial base when it joined? They had the largest oil, coal, and steel production by far. So basically, they were on a territory that was out of reach for Europeans, so they just had to wait, and they would overwhelm everyone with their numbers. It's just a matter of time. They didn't have any... Even assuming that the Japanese had succeeded in their gamble, which was to eliminate the American Pacific Fleet in order to secure dominance over the Pacific. Once they had secured the route to Indonesian oil, because that was their goal, they wanted to secure the route to Indonesian oil to then operate their navy. They had absolutely no access to coal. Not to the same extent as the United States. Anyway, the United States was bound to win eventually. And the same could be said for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Back then it was the same. They used hydrocarbons, iron ore, and more as their rear base. As much as they wanted, so the United States, a country that sits on infinite resources, and which moreover was built through violence, That is to say, the first settlers arrived and wiped out the Native Americans, the grizzlies, the bison, the trees, and also developed the pioneer culture. That is to say, if it belongs to no one, it belongs to me. And besides, even if it belongs to you, it's kind of mine too. So the combination of that mentality with excess, with opulence, in a way, with infinity. In terms of resources, it can't produce people who are willing to face limits. The limit doesn't exist. The sky is the limit. And that's why, if there aren't any more at my place, there are still some. And if there aren't any more at my place, there are some at your place. And if there aren't any more at your place, there are some on Mars. And if you don't agree, it's the same price.
There's almost a cultural block to accepting this idea. Yes,
Trump is demonstrating it masterfully right now, and if you don't agree, it's the same price. I'll walk right over you and impose my will. A country like that isn't our intellectual competitor, it's our enemy. The United States, though, is not our enemy. But what I mean is that they're our current adversaries. I mean as a state, not as individuals. Afterwards, you can find remarkable individuals within any regime that overall is heading in the wrong direction. But if I look at the overall dynamic of the country, they're heading in one direction and they'll persist as long as they can. In my opinion, that's not the path we as Europeans should take. We import 97% of our oil, 90% of our gas, 50% of our coal, and 80% of our copper, among other resources. And some of the best. We're an old, constrained, and dense country. On the other hand, we have the advantage of having historically developed an intellectual agility that allows us to make the most of a constrained environment. That's a major asset. Instead of trying to copy them with artificial intelligence, we're better off not imitating them. Using this skill helps us invent tomorrow's world and eventually gain a competitive advantage. It will benefit us and eventually help us sell needed items to others. For me, there's no need to hesitate, but I'm going to reconnect this to the previous question. To move ahead quickly, we must move past the climate issue, as it's still an area where we act for the common good. If we reduce emissions in France, it doesn't just protect the French climate, it protects the global climate. Whereas if I come to terms with the fact that we're already stuck when it comes to importing fossil fuels, when I act, I'm being selfish, so my motivation is stronger. So I have a big regret, which is that indeed politicians are not taking this on, because as I was saying, they are victims of an optical illusion, which consists of thinking that the truth is in the price, when that's not true. The truth is in the volume. And that they haven't understood the importance of machines in the modern world, I don't understand.
I'd like us to go back a bit to what it means to be able to meet the objectives. Technician YNC today is entitled to a fifth of the purchasing power. You first the
carbon footprint per French person is about 10 tons of carbon monoxide, 2 equivalent per person per year. That means that to make and use everything I'm going to consume in a year, the heating of my home, possibly the air conditioning, the energy for my transportation, manufacture of all items supplied to me by industry, my backpack, my clothes, my shoes, my couch, the pan I bought, the pot, the washing machine I replaced, I don't know what else, for eating, including public services, that's 10 tons per French person each year. To stay within 2 degrees, global emissions must drop by at least a third by 2050. And in a world where everyone has the right to the same carbon footprint, that means people can have a 2-ton carbon footprint by 2050. I need to cut mine from 10 to 2 using 5 times less fossil fuels. So besides improved energy efficiency, I now run 1/5 as many machines. Some due to energy efficiency, some from renewables and nuclear, but overall what? So my purchasing power is cut by 5. I have 5 times fewer boats traveling on land. I have 5 times fewer trucks driving in France. Well, all things being equal, not yet anyway. There's a small gain, that's it, but that's what it means. So indeed it means that my purchasing power, I can only buy things if they're made and benefit from services if they're produced. So for my ability to buy, if we produce 5 times less, I can buy 5 times less. So I'll have 5 times fewer shoes to buy, 5 times fewer pants, 5 times fewer pots, 5 times fewer. That's how it is. So that's pretty much what it means.
To sum it up broadly, in 25 years, we need to have reached a society where right now, each person owns a 1-ton car. Today, we find ourselves in a world where 2 people basically have to share a 500-kilogram car. We used to be allowed 5 computers, but now we can only have 1 in our lifetime.
Yes, that means that, so it's not physically impossible, all of this. No, of course. We could extend computer lifespans by not releasing a new operating system every year. However, this trade-off would slow technological progress as it would not advance as quickly. It's when I replace my computer, when I replace my camera, when I replace my watch, and so on. Upgrading often means I always have the latest model, so I continuously enjoy technological progress. If I upgrade less often, I experience less technological progress.
That still leaves us, starting with today's 600 slaves.
That still leaves us with 100. It's neither the Stone Age nor the Middle Ages. So it's clear it's a major effort, and this effort, it goes along with a word I mentioned earlier, which is the feeling of fairness and social justice. So I'll start with an anecdote. It so happens that there is. It's been about 2 or 3 years. On a morning radio show, I was asked whether aviation should do its part in reducing global emissions. What flight options will individuals have in 2050? So I did a quick calculation in which the resident of Chad, the resident of Brazil, and the resident of Norway all have the same right to fly during their lifetime. It's not about that. It's in French, no discrimination. And I do a quick mental calculation, and I tell myself that it must be about 4 flights in a lifetime. Afterward, I did the calculation in Excel, and fortunately also got 4. This one got a bit of buzz. Now they label me for saying everyone should get 4 flights in a lifetime, but I won't suggest that anymore. I'm doing a calculation about what that means. It's clear I'm for less air travel, but that's another topic. And there were polls that came out where people were asked, are you ready to fly less? I don't know, And then one day I saw a poll. I really need to find it again because I haven't seen it since. In that poll, people were asked, are you okay with flying less often in your life? Yes, 40. And then right after, they asked the question, are you okay with flying less often in your life? And if we ban private jets, then the majority says yes. So what does this question tell us? It says that a significant part of the population agrees to make the effort on the condition that it is shared with Lenin's old formula, from each according to his ability. So, in other words, I'm willing to drive my little scooter less, but the guy with a Porsche, I want him to be penalized even more than me for driving his Porsche. Personally, I think that's fair. I belong to the upper socio-professional group and earn well above average. I would find it completely normal to be taxed more than average in a country that seriously cares about the issue. I'm not sure how much of that is demagoguery versus sincerity. But Michel-Édouard Leclerc, who did the opening interview for Salamé's new 8 p.m. show a few weeks ago, said something similar by saying, I'm ready to be taxed more. If it's for something reasonable, he mentioned social housing, not climate change, but it's the same idea. I'm interested in sociologically analyzing people with some wealth in this country to find out how much more they're willing to be stretched than the average, as long as we have a collective project that brings hope, energy, and ties back to what I was saying earlier. Are we pursuing a societal project, not just an accounting approach? The current prime ministers are out of touch. They're just managing the cash register. That's the consequence of having an exciting project. It's not the exciting project itself. Managing the cash register annoys everyone. Just covering your overdraft every month isn't a life goal, it's a limitation. And so, in my opinion, what's missing for us to get this accepted is the overall project component. But I think people today are ready to make efforts as long as those efforts are recognized. Like, they won't ask me to make an effort others with more resources are exempt from. I think it's perfectly reasonable for the answer to be like that. It seems normal to me.
You often make the distinction between sobriety and poverty. Can we go back to that a bit? Precisely because it ties back to the question of wealth distribution.
In my energy savings classification. As an engineer, I enjoy taxonomy and categories, which is how I teach energy savings to my students. So there are 3 categories of energy savings. The first one is what we call efficiency. So efficiency is, I have a coffee maker that makes coffee. My coffee maker. I managed to make it using less energy, and I managed to make it work using less energy. That's in the realm of efficiency, meaning my single device uses less energy while keeping similar technical features. Everyone appreciates this kind of energy saving since it doesn't take away from the consumer. It puts engineers and producers to work, so those industrialists should just do their job. I can relax on my couch with my coffee, no problem. The second category of energy saving we can have is called sobriety. Sobriety means I drink less coffee, so I drink less coffee and I don't drink anything else instead. I just drink less coffee instead of switching to another hot drink that uses more energy. At that point, my coffee maker runs less often, so I use less electricity, so I've saved energy. All right, that's called sobriety, and later I'll talk about the rebound effect because it's the devil. I chose the third energy saving option for its sobriety. It's a service I use less often, a consumption I deliberately do less. Another example, I used to drive 10 kilometers to work, but now I bike every other day instead of using my car. Well, if I do that, that's sobriety. I'm going to use half as much gas to get to work. And I've decided it. I'm happy to exercise since it's less stressful and plan to do it every nice summer day, but I still don't want anything, no matter what. The third energy saving category, it's not when you choose not to use a service or a product, it's when you stop using it because you can't afford it anymore. So I'm going to stop using the car and use a moped or my bike. It's not that I wanted to stop using my car, but I can't afford it anymore. That's called poverty, and poverty also leads to saving energy. Poor people live in small apartments, fly less, eat less meat, and drive small cars if they have cars at all. So by necessity, they use less energy than those who can afford those things. It's not by choice, but by necessity. And so these three categories of energy savings are very different in nature. Efficiency puts the effort on the producer, while sobriety and poverty put the effort on the consumer. Efficiency, on the other hand, offers the possibility of a rebound effect, because from the moment I use my coffee maker less, which will consume less electricity, that electricity which is available, maybe, but it'll be tough to stop completely, I'll cut back on coffee and use the blender more for smoothies. At that point, I would have just switched. I wouldn't have reduced my overall consumption just to do so. You simply need to use less of everything. And in a way, I'm going to say something a bit unconventional, to just get rid of the money we haven't used. If I use it for anything else, that's not true sobriety. It's just a transfer, so there you go. Then people tell me we can save it, but even if we save it, how does that increase? Other people's consumption is complicated, but oh well. Anyway, there's a real issue with efficiency and with moderation. Poverty is complex. There's no rebound effect. If I have less and consume less, I can't just start consuming more since I still lack resources. And what I'm saying to conclude is that in a world where energy supply we'll be forced to decrease. Anyway, thank you. What we don't achieve with efficiency and moderation will be forced by poverty. That's why I'm so committed to plans that allow us to act voluntarily. Because the worst option is poverty, because unlike moderation, poverty is something that's forced upon us, and it feels like our destiny is out of our hands. And at that point, we start voting for anyone and wishing for anything, hoping that it will bring about a better world. So poverty is the breeding ground for instability. And besides, it's not pleasant because you feel like you're being forced without having chosen it. Riding a bike to stay healthy is very different from riding because you can't afford to drive. I mean, the first option is very good, the second one much less so. So that's why I think sobriety is an antidote to populism. It may sound surprising, but I believe it. Because you have to make it desirable. Making it desirable can't be done on that basis. At least if you tell people they're going to use their car less, that's not desirable, you're telling me less. If I set something up for you that makes you drive less but don't mention it, people might not notice. Take parents who organize walking buses for their kids to school, taking turns walking. If we frame it as the kids being happy, seeing friends sooner and chatting on the way to school, it could work. Even if recess is short, they'll still laugh and joke around. That's a good thing. If we sell it that way, it's because you're idiots. If you drive your kids to school, it's less appealing, so it's about moderation. You have to find a positive way to sell it. If we sell it from the angle that it's good to consume less, that's better. It's still complicated. Each time you really have to rack your brain to find strong arguments that make people want to change the way they behave. Because actually, it's the positive aspect that dominates, and the negative aspect, they won't even notice it. Well, negative, meaning the fact that they're changing their habits, they won't even notice it.
So you have to bring them along towards sobriety. But at the same time, I almost want to say we should make certain technical objects undesirable, like typically making it outdated to own an SUV.
So attention needs to be diverted to something else. So from time to time, using a bit of the stick can still be useful. I mean, like what was done in Paris with SUVs, with parking tickets that are more expensive the bigger your car is. That doesn't make me cry. So from time to time, it's not bad to do that a little, but we can't just do that.
Is this a project on which... Are you considering it here at the Shift project? I'd also like to discuss what it is, if we have to list the priorities a bit, because I feel like there are so many things we could talk about. I don't know, the restructuring of the urban fabric, the reduction of energy consumption and food. There are so many things. I feel like we're stuck or paralyzed by how big the problem is. It's like a 38-ton truck is coming and we're just standing in the road. Arnaud, with whom I worked a bit on preparing the interview, suggested an interesting metaphor. He said that we're kind of like in a chess game where we find ourselves in a situation where the players are stuck. And basically you have to sacrifice some pieces to take others and get a position that allows you to win the game. What's the priority and which pawns can we afford to lose even if they're essential? But honestly, those won't change the course of the game.
You have a question that's not simple, no?
No, but have you ever had one? A simple question.
No. So, can everything that needs to be done fit into a single brain? The answer is no. So, at Project Chiffre, first of all, there aren't just one of us, there are 30, and then we're not going to ask each of the 30 people to have the entire plan in their heads. So the way we work is that we say we'll tackle the problem piece by piece. So one person will take care of daily mobility, another will handle long-distance mobility, which doesn't have the same factors. Daily or constrained mobility involves work, errands, and school. Long-distance mobility, 90% of the time, is for vacations or leisure. It's very simple. These are not the same factors, whereas usually work accounts for a third or half of daily mobility. Another person will take care of textiles, another will handle heavy industry, and another will be in charge of healthcare. One person will take care of culture, and another will handle housing. All right, that's how we're going to do it, and each person who takes on a part of the problem will be responsible for two things. In their area, how can we make progress? We ensure progress in one area doesn't use resources needed by others to advance. We also have a cross-functional project here, currently with a temporary code name. It's called Strob, that's our code name. And in more elaborate terms, I would say we call it a loopback. That is, it's making sure that when we look at all the resources requested by each sector in order to move forward, all of those resources, it matches what we can reasonably expect to get from the environment and not 4 times that amount. Example of biomass. We aim to produce sustainable fuels for air transport and biofuels for road transport. People and animals want it for food, while we want it for biodiversity, which means leaving it untouched. Energy companies wanted to make wood boilers, and farmers wanted to produce biogas. Well, anyway, so what if we add all that up? Does it match the amount of biomass we can have in France through photosynthesis? And what if the answer is that we end up with 4 times that amount? I still forgot the wood builders for construction, so it doesn't add up. Now everyone has to go back to the drawing board. So that, in the proposed plan, the amount of biomass required by a given sector is compatible with the overall biomass availability in the country. We can apply the example I gave to all physical resources. We can repeat this for copper, square meters of land, fish, renewable electricity, and all physical resources. We can repeat the exercise, and we can also repeat this exercise for skills. Because we need many people to insulate homes, make electric cars, build bike lanes, and transform agriculture all at once. Same here. We'll need millions of people we currently lack. And so that's why we also have a project here about how we make sure that the people who will succeed us tomorrow are ready. They won't become YouTubers and useless consultants, but they'll become farmers, plumbers, because there will be less need for consultants and more need for other useful jobs. That's what's surprising. We work here and we don't ask anyone, not even the whole system, to have all the details of every sector in their head. Nobody does that, just like in a company or organization. Today, there is a division of labor and a division of knowledge, so there are always points of connection. That means people need to be able to talk to each other, and so they need to have enough knowledge in common so they can communicate. The people in charge need to have enough sampling of what's happening on the level below to be able to see whether the whole thing is working or not. But nobody has the whole answer in their head. It's just not possible. That's it. But we organize ourselves so that it's not necessary.
A few months ago, you did a fundraising round. You managed to raise 4.5. The ambition behind that is to have influence in the next elections. How do you plan to do that? Getting fully involved is a lobbying job?
I'll give an honest answer, and then an answer that's pragmatic. The honest answer is that most likely we won't have a significant impact. The outcome of the next presidential election will be determined by factors that are completely beyond our control. The spirit of revenge of such a demagogic politician is clearly visible. The heinous murder involving a foreigner from the day before, what is it? I know. It's not a big deal. We're still doing something useful. Why are we? Society as it is headed is going to run into crises. A crisis is when we question ourselves. And it's the moment when we might possibly take a direction that's different from the previous one. We saw it during the COVID period. There was hope that, well, there were some changes like remote work, cycling, and so on. So there are some practices where COVID really acted as an accelerator or a reorienter. Could the next presidential election trigger a crisis? I don't think so. We'll vote and elect someone no matter who. But will French society avoid a crisis in the next 10 years? I don't think so, and so that's why we can't say, we are preparing for a timeless crisis. That doesn't exist, it's not marketable, so this is much more marketable. So saying that is an honest answer, but after that I'll give the pragmatic answer and say we act as if our work was going to influence the presidential election in 2 years, and that's the timeline we're settling into. And besides, it has a lot of benefits because it forces us to deliver on time. And also, it will allow us to take advantage of a media window of opportunity. In our country, presidential elections are when we debate the main directions for the future. It's when we have many media opportunities not available at other times. So, it's actually very good for us to make this work known, to have the opportunity to talk about it and so on. That it comes out at this time. The pragmatic answer is that all 4 or 5 million contributors might be thinking, they're telling us that our thing is going to be useless, no, but they're making fun of us. Give the money back, so no, we're not going to give the money back at all. We're still going to do something very useful because what we're actually preparing is the evacuation plan in case of fire. The evacuation plan in case of fire. We need to do it before the fire starts, not after. Our plan to transform France's economy. It's essential that it's ready for when a crisis happens so that someone doesn't say, oh damn, what do I do now? Oh, there's something, maybe I'll check it out. That's when we'll have opportunities, and that moment is absolutely certain to come. But will it match both angles? No, it can happen before or after. So yes, what we're doing is fundamentally useful because we're drawing out the way we could organize ourselves in a future that will physically be the one we have with us. So yes, it's useful and essential. Now, in 10 years, do we align ourselves with the presidential election calendar? Do we actually align ourselves with the moment when this work will be most useful? No, but it doesn't matter because, once again, no one else but us is doing it. This work, and my feeling is that it's important. Last point, as long as we live in a democracy, and I hope to die in such a system, even if it has flaws. I've been accused of admiring the Chinese totalitarian system, but I actually prefer democracy and embrace it myself. The Churchillian maxim, which is that it's the most imperfect of systems, except for all the others. Just because we criticize it doesn't mean we don't want to keep it. We might want to improve it or change it eventually. So as long as we live in a democracy, democracy is an evolving system, and we can clearly see that. Besides, right now, we're reaching new heights of demagoguery, where politicians don't see themselves as needing to have a vision. They view themselves as carrying out their voters' wishes. It's the peak. Right now, they're incapable of behaving like responsible adults. They're all paralyzed. And if I do that, I'll miss the next electoral alliance. So, in this upward system, what's essential is to work with civil society. At the Shift project, there are 30 of us, but including shifters, it's about 15,000. We don't have the means to address every French woman and every French man directly in their own kitchen. We need 1 million people, but we don't have that many. Which means that the only way we have to influence the course of things is to address the established bodies and the decision makers of those bodies. They, on their side, have influence both downward because they have a dialogue with the people they represent and so on. A business owner with 50 to 100 employees in a small and medium-sized enterprise regularly talks with his staff. He meets almost all of them every day. Well, not every day, but almost. And then, except for rare cases, his colleagues don't think he's the biggest idiot. There's usually a conference. So if I convince him, I also convince 80 others I want to say. So the chief project's tactic is to address them. Here, it's not directly to the boss, but to established bodies, decision makers from business, unions, academia, thought leaders, and association leaders. So, when we work there, for example, in the agricultural world, well, we talked with all the so-called representative organizations of the agricultural world, with the chambers of agriculture, with veterinarians, etc. Also with a set number of people directly. What's important is making allies in that world. That is, as part of the work we're going to do on the subject that concerns them. They start to have enough respect for our way of moving forward that we can establish a quality dialogue. And then, afterward, they take ownership of part of the work, to which, incidentally, they will have contributed. So that's it. Our goal is to get useful enough with a certain number of sectors, one by one, so that afterwards we have allies and people who take it up themselves within the sector, and who will then carry forward what has been designed, as I said earlier, in coordination with what the others have to do. And we hope that if we have enough people in civil society who join our way of seeing things, eventually this will be reflected in political action. It's a long-term endeavor. It also means that the internal mindset of elected officials needs to change. That takes a generation.
Let's say that awareness is really spreading throughout society. What does that look like? A positive alternate history in a decade, and let's say in a 50-year time frame.
I can't answer that because it's similar to the earlier question. What does a world with over 2 degrees look like? I understand the requirements very well, except that there are so many physically realistic possibilities that I don't know how to answer that question. I know how to answer the question of which direction we should push today, but where will we end up in 10 years? I'm not able to answer that question, because we'll discover some things as we move forward in this positive alternate history. What do French diplomacy and geopolitics look like? I can't answer that question today. I have no idea. What do social relations look like in France? I can't answer that question. I know how to answer what. It makes sense for me to spend tomorrow pursuing what matters to me. I know how to answer that question. How do I describe the world as it is if my dreams come true? I can name a number of things you find there. For example, peace. For example, hope. Once I've said that, I've said everything and nothing.
Yes, those are the king and queen in chess.
I've said everything and nothing. That doesn't tell me how many hectares there will be per farmer and how many people work in the countryside. Describing the world includes describing such things. I can't say that today.
Do you have a closing punchline, or should we just end it here with a fade to black?
Stopping on something I don't know is always a bit unpleasant, but we can stop here. I'm not the master of time. I'm not the master of the questions. To circle back to a question we mentioned earlier, where will we be in 10 years? If things have gone well, there's one thing that seems obvious to me. Well, ideally, it would be that we've actually moved into a world where the economic convention has lost its importance. We're relearning to think a bit more in terms of physical units.
We judge a society's success differently.
Yes, and we're a bit less obsessed with euros. And we manage to have our minds a bit more elsewhere. Basically, that's it. It's something that seems to me to be a condition anyway, a condition for achieving anything enjoyable. It's a bit different from saying I want degrowth. I want the degrowth of the space taken up by euros in our brains.
But the growth of a whole lot of other things alongside it.
Nature abhors a vacuum, as they say, though that's not quite true in interstellar space, but never mind. If euros take up less space in our brains, we might have more room for other things. Something worse could happen, like warlike feelings, but I hope things will mostly improve. That is, our minds will be occupied by things that make us happy and that aren't necessarily strictly monetary. Today we're getting closer. Have lunch, people have mental health problems. It's monstrous. What's the point of having accumulated all this gross domestic product if this is where it leads?
Without a horizon, utopia no longer exists.
That's what I was saying earlier.
That's something you're working on at the Shift project.
Not as such. It's something that concerns me personally at the Shift project. We're not working on ways to improve people's mental health. However, we will be working in collaboration with the CNAM on actions that both improve people's health and reduce emissions. So, active mobility, for example, can we? Because the CNAM has an obvious interest. If people are healthier, they spend less and have more balanced accounts.
And they'll run happily.
Exactly. So, can we make it so that people get dopamine and endorphins on their own, like grown-ups? With techniques or behaviors that, by the way, are more sober and more economical than those based on our fossil fuel machines. So, that's definitely a topic we're going to dig into together, and we'll start pretty soon. One of the things I've learned with age is that, in the end, the answer to the question, once we've realized that technology won't save us, is something else. The question is what will save us? So we have to go into territory that's not natural for an engineer. Some handle it well. They study philosophy of science, philosophy in general, and play the trumpet like Borisian. I'm not talented at playing the trumpet, so... But with time, I try to go a bit further into the question. I'm not going to say philosophical because I got a 6 on my philosophy exam, but who is? How can we reinvent things in the areas of meaning, values, and similar topics? Something that is desirable enough so that in the end, it motivates us to accept the amount of effort we will inevitably have to make regarding material consumption, and maybe to see it less as an effort than we would see it today.
It's not the end, but a new beginning.
Anyway, the world is going to change, whether we like it or not, and once again, I would much rather it be a world that changes willingly.